Atlantic challenges between commonalities and differences, also the new dynamic of the transatlantic basin. To talk about that, I'd like to introduce you to our four guests. Please welcome Jorge Castañeda, who is a distinguished professor of Latin American and Caribbean studies, also a prominent politician since he's the former foreign minister of Mexico from the year 2000 to 2003. Please sit wherever it pleases you. Our second guest, who is the director of the Center for Transatlantic Relation at Johns Hopkins University. Mr. Sunjoy Joshi, who is the director of Observer Research Foundation based in New Delhi. He also worked at different positions within the government of India for 25 years. Welcome. And finally, our four guests, please welcome Mr. Seth Stodder, who works now at the University of Southern California Law School, but he's here also in his capacity since he served at under Obama's administration for border migration trade policy during the Obama administration. So I'm going to tell you an issue of transatlantic border, looking for papers for researchers to talk about this and to give us some inputs, and there are very few. We are lucky enough to have Mr. Hamilton, who is the director, as I told you, for the Center of Transatlantic Studies. Can you present you in a few words your work of research and also explain where do we stand today within these transatlantic basins in 2017? What are the new dynamics?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank the OCP Center for having us all here. It's a great event, and it continues a great tradition over the last few years. My center at Johns Hopkins, we've been working on a similar idea that, which we call the Atlantic Basin Initiative, which is to look at how are happening and developing between the four continents of the Atlantic. And I think when we say transatlantic, I think in normal usage it means North Atlantic. But what I'd like to do is talk about the PanAtlantic, which means the full Atlantic basin. And you know, I think it's time for a different narrative, because we have been enthralled by this notion that globalization somehow is really all about the rise of the Pacific. And I think globalization by definition is not about one part of the world. And if you look at connections between continents, which is one definition of globalization, developing among the four continents of the Atlantic. I think the other sort of narrative that we've been focused on the last decade or so, Kishore Mahbubani called the Asian Hemisphere. You know, the rise of Asia is going to change the world, obviously. But by definition, again, if there's an Asian hemisphere, then there's an Atlantic hemisphere. It's just a definitional point. So what we've been doing is looking at these connections among the Atlantic continents and see, is there something distinctive that should point us to actually looking deeper? And the Atlantic Dialogues has been doing that in a somewhat different way, but it's all very related. And I think there's a developing narrative here that we should push further. And let me just give you three examples of, I think, what we found in the Atlantic. One is energy. All through the Atlantic Basin, we're seeing an incipient Atlantic energy system developing. The Pacific consumes energy, but the Atlantic is the energy innovator. It is about a third of oil and gas production in the world. It is about 80% of biofuels. All along the Atlantic in terms of shale, unconventional, conventional, as well as low carbon renewables, the Atlantic is driving much of the energy development. And yet it's an area of extreme wealth in energy terms and extreme energy poverty. And so the question is, can we convert some of this commonality into focused attention, for instance, to bring universal energy access across that region, particularly. What you saw in the Paris Climate Agreement negotiations, I would argue, was the first concrete manifestation of an Atlantic coalition. Because if you remember what happened, frankly, it was the US and Europe, South America, joining with African countries to say we have to have this agreement. And it was really that coalition that pushed the global deal that finally got done. So there's something there. The second area is the Atlantic Ocean itself. The Atlantic Ocean has characteristics that are particularly distinctive that those who live in the Atlantic Basin should pay maybe a bit more attention to. The scientific community and much of the world ocean experts, they talk about the world ocean. It's all water. Someone in Shanghai might not be paying as much attention to as someone who lives here. One is that the Atlantic Ocean is the Earth's, the planet's, locus for the currents that heat the north and provide circulation throughout the world ocean. They're centered in the Atlantic. And there are many indications that thermohaline system is changing, which could have radical implications for all sorts of countries all over, not just in the Atlantic, but actually around the world. The Atlantic is also a major source of carbon storage. The oceans store a lot of the carbon that we have to do, and the Atlantic plays a particular role there. There is a huge growth of expanses of the oceans that are deprived of oxygen, then they're expanding. And many of them are off the African coasts. So I could go on the Atlantic Ocean, but there's something distinctive about it that deserves better attention, and yet most ocean work is done either in a North Atlantic context, a South Atlantic context, or global. There's nothing in which we're actually working together. The last point I would make, just to give examples, are what I would call the dark networks of the Atlantic Basin. Guns, drugs, terror. The things we have been talking about, particularly in an African context, but if you look what's happening, this is becoming an Atlantic network. Cocaine, other drugs produced in South America filter up to North America, but they also cross over to Africa, hub and transshipment point for these drugs up to Europe. And it is fueled by gun sales and others also from North America. It gives it that protection. And then it starts to interact and give power to terrorist elements that are also based in these areas. We discuss West Africa, the Sahel, other things as a challenge of terrorism, and yet it's all fueled by these other dark links. And they are becoming this circular system. And again, there is no PanAtlantic mechanism to deal with this. So I would argue we have to think harder about that. And again, there's a difference here between the Atlantic and the Pacific. The Atlantic doesn't asterisk security challenges that we can envision, say, with North Korea, or with my colleague here, India and Pakistan. But the Pacific challenges seem to be sort of state-to-state security challenges, more traditional ones that we know. The Atlantic, it seems to me, we are confronted together by intrastate security challenges. These flows, transnational flows, as I said, guns, drugs, and terror, are challenging us all. It's a common security challenge. And we have to sort of focus on this, it seems to me, with a new narrative and a new mindset that allow us to get to some solutions. Because if we each approach it in the old North Atlantic, South Atlantic frame, or each on our own continents, we're not appreciating how these deep linkages are forcing us together, both in very positive ways, but also in some negative ways.
We've seen about Latin America towards States, Africa towards European Union, so we probably need to make other This is what has been done, for example, under the Obama administration to strengthen the ties between Latin America or Europe or Africa. Can you give us concrete examples of what has been done?
Sure, you talking to me? Yeah, I mean, speaking as a person who served in the Obama administration, I mean, obviously, the current regime in the United States is a little bit different. But, I mean, our view, I think, was, I mean, I'll take it actually before the Obama administration, in both Bush as well as Obama. And I think what happened to the United States, I think, in fits and starts after 9/11, especially in a lot of these areas, is that I think our interdependence with the rest of the world in a much more fulsome way. And certainly within North America, with Canada and Mexico especially, in terms of looking at these transnational problems, that we could not actually address problems of migration or organized crime or terrorism, whatever else, by being kind of throwing up the walls and throwing up the moats around the United States and protecting ourselves that way, because that would destroy the US economy and destroy civil liberties and freedom in the United States. So we very much in the Bush, and especially I think in the Obama administration, I think took the view that we had to work to knit together the North American community, for one, to protect the perimeter of the Americas with regard to terrorism, and work collaboratively on issues of organized crime with Mexico, work collaboratively with Mexico and Canada, especially with regard to building the North American economy and taking down barriers to trade between our countries along our borders, and really sort of fulfilling the promise of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I think with regard to the transatlantic relationship, certainly the United States, the Bush administration obviously had its issues with regard to Europe in light of the Iraq War and all that, but I think certainly with the Obama years, I think again, we embraced our interdependence in a way to, as really fundamentally the way to combat the terrorist threat with regard to ISIS and others, which was sharing information, working collaboratively to find foreign terrorist fighters, and develop a common approach to addressing these sort of transnational challenges. And I think with regard to Africa from the United States, although I think the United States had a very, I don't think the US really sort of viewed the world in terms of a transatlantic basin. I think the US viewed our relationship with the Americas in one way, our relationship with Europe in a different way, and our relationship with Africa in a different way, but not necessarily in one cohesive whole in thinking of the transatlantic basin. And I think that remains true today. Now, so that was the Obama, I think, and to some extent Bush view of the world. I think Trump has taken us in a completely different direction in the sense of, I think, rejecting kind of the view, I think, since 9/11, that America's future was in embracing its interdependence with the rest of the world, and especially within North America. Trump has taken a completely different view, sort of an America first, walls, travel bans, that kind of view, that I think has the potential to be completely disastrous, but I think it's just politically within the United States. So I don't think it will have time to become completely disastrous, but it's certainly negative right now.
Before we go on because we're starting with these opening remarks, before we go to the Asian basin, because we want to also compare what has been done on the other parts of the world, Mr. Castañeda, do you feel there's a breakdown of the transatlantic basin relation, or as you were saying, like they kindly never existed? If now today we have a vacuum of leadership, of which country could take a lead of the idea of building this relationship?
Well, I think, they're just looking at the vacuum that the United States under the Trump administration is creating in international and regional organizations. One is diversification. The Latin Americans should try and work more with the Africans, or the Latin Americans should try and work more with the Asians, or the Europeans, or the Africans with the Asians, etc. I have my doubts about the viability of any of this, quite honestly. The complementarities are not there, the historical traditions are not there. It's very difficult for any of that really to happen, I believe, beyond anecdotes, which are always interesting but not necessarily very relevant. Where I think countries like those in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, can try and fill the vacuum is in the international or regional organizations, the multilaterals and the regional ones that have been created these last 70 years or even more in the pre-World War II institutions, which can be very significant. If you just first look at the list of the things that Trump has already blown up, or blown up American participation in them, and I'm sure I'm missing some. UNESCO, TPP, the immigration program conference that just sessioned in Mexico in Puerto Vallarta, and that Trump withdrew literally on the eve of the conference after it had been very constructive and very involved in planning and drafting and everything. Literally the eve, which in addition was not very nice to the host country. Forget the substance. Paris, obviously, Paris climate change. At a more regional level, NAFTA. And I'm sure we can find more that have already taken place. But if we also want to look at those that might take place in one way or the other over the coming months, well, first of all, of course, there's the UN. And, Secretary General Guterres is, I think, dealing on an hourly basis with budgets somewhere or by somebody as a result of American or Trump administration decisions. The organization, the human rights components, the court and the commission, but mainly the OAS itself, which is not a body that the Trump people feel very close to. They don't like the idea. What's left of TTIP and the negotiations between the Europeans and the Americans on trade. And then, of course, it can become even more complicated if we move to the WTO, which is beginning to be the object of very severe criticisms by USTR Representative Lighthizer. And why not the World Bank and the IMF? Like these other things that we already mentioned, there's no good reason to like the World Bank or the IMF. They cost the Americans money. They do things that people like Trump don't like. Well, it stands to reason that maybe we just start budget cutting there too. So if all of this is a fact, then the key question is, what can fill the vacuum? Well, there's a lot of ideas out there. I don't want to go into too many of them, but rather simply state one. I don't see, for example, the Chinese, for reasons that Hubert Védrine mentioned a little while ago, as being able to fill that vacuum yet. They have had a foreign policy maybe now for 2 years, 3 years, and I think I'm pushing it. That's it. Before then, it was the admiral back in the 16th century. So you can't just all of a sudden, they don't have the capacity, they don't have the ideology for a foreign policy of that nature, or they don't have necessarily the money to put into these things which they don't necessarily like. They put money into their own bank, but I'm not sure they're going to put a lot of money into the World Bank and things like that. The European Union, well, again, a similar problem. How much are they willing to do under existing conditions of Brexit, of nationalist movements in each one of the major countries, etc. So what could be done is have countries like ours in Latin America, like the Africans, like the Asians and the Europeans, strengthen existing international multilateral institutions that can be done there. These are institutions that have outridden the passage of time. They've survived severe crises at different, have some new ones, like the International Criminal Court, which are especially interesting. There are all sorts of opportunities there. So my sense would be that the transatlantic dialogue, if anything, should be centered on this. How can countries that don't have necessarily much in common find something in common in the multilateral arrangements?
Yeah, exactly. The main question is, how do we do? Because obviously we are all here because we agree on the idea that regionalism is important to create a new, strong voice. How did it work? For example, you were talking about the Indian, which I think, in my view, is the Indian Ocean, because it englobes also East Africa and up to Southeast Asia. Based in New Delhi, you were actually discussing in the back that it doesn't even work in Asia, or you have too many differences. Or can you just give us an overview of what's happening on the other side also?
Thank you, Sophie, and of course I must thank the OCP for getting me in as, first of all, the only interloper, the non-Atlantic interloper into this discussion. And I also see that all the other speakers are from the other side of the pond. So this side of the pond is also not represented, so probably I'll end up speaking for both.
Please do.
So there is definitely some kind of problem. There was an Atlantic consensus. That Atlantic consensus seems to have got rather frayed at the edges. Some would say it has broken down. Some would say it has got frayed at the edges. Reference was made to WTO discussions in Buenos Aires. They've just concluded without any agreement. And the biggest champion of the World Trade Organization today is his greatest critic. And that is not just a matter of WTO. Whether you look at climate change, that was mentioned. Whether you look at, I go on to other forms of global governance, governance of the commons of space, you have governance of the commons of cyber governance. All these are going in for some major frictions. See, it is easy to blame Trump and say everything is his fault. And this is the guy who's primarily responsible. My position would be that Trump is only a symptom. He's not really the cause of it all. And the changes which have started happening are far deeper. Trump may be there as a representative of what has happened. I'm not going to pass judgment on him. Whether he's good or bad, probably he'll be impeached or whatever else happens to him. But it's an important marker. It's an important marker as to what has happened. I think what has led to Trumpism, what has led to the situation which exists in the Atlantic and why the Atlantic, to do with, and if you place two milestones, the first milestone would be 9/11. The second milestone would be 2008, the economic crisis. And that both of these events led to certain changes. I'll come back to 9/11 later. But as far as 2008 was concerned, the complete distrust, disgust with the solutions offered by the elite towards where the world was headed with globalization, with global value chains, what was happening, it started being perceived very, very differently. It was felt that Wall Street did not have the solutions. The Davos man did not have the solutions to the problems. I mean, today you also hear, people will whisper and say, oh, maybe the Rust Belt should be disenfranchised. They don't even know how to vote. They should not be allowed to vote. And one of the fundamentals of this consensus, of what I call the Atlantic consensus, was that democracy is the best guarantor of globalization, of free trade, of open markets. So it is all promoted as one value package. Now this is the consensus which is broken down. You're finding that democracy, well, people in Africa and Asia always knew it, that democracy was not the best guarantor. Democracy would throw up leaders. Democracy would throw up questions which would shatter free markets, which would rattle free markets, do lots of things. Because democracy works out by misdirections. It finds its way, it weaves its way in and out. And we've experienced it in India, we've experienced it in large parts of the world. Like India. When they went to WTO, to GATT, there was always humming and hawing and not taking positions because things were not very, very clear. And we are yet in that situation. Then there are deep structural changes, now taking place. And let me speak about the structural changes. See, the notion of the Atlantic itself belongs to the 20th century. It was a different world. Post-Second World War, post the Cold War. That notion is outdated. We are now in the 21st century. Today, connectivity and globalization does not flow through ships sailing on oceans. It is a matter of data flows. And data flows don't depend on the oceans. They transfer seamless. 9/11 made a fundamental difference between the outlook of Europe and the outlook of America towards what was happening in cyberspace. And what did 9/11 do? Post 9/11, the US, instead of going in for targeted surveillance in the pursuit of security, went in for mass surveillance. And it became a credo. That is what started happening. Europe is alarmed. Europe today still has very strong privacy laws. There is a deep conflict today between European companies, between American companies, and the Europe governance systems as to what is happening in cyberspace. As far as the US is concerned, Europe does not understand cyber. Europe does not understand technology. And if there's any idea which comes out of Europe on cyberspace, it must be
do you think that would be the reason why what you say, the Asian hemisphere works and the Atlantic hemisphere didn't? Why would you compare both, and where do you see the Atlantic failing? Why do you see the differences between the two regions? Why did they manage to create an homogeneous region despite differences in Asia?
Well, I'm not suggesting some exclusive block or something. We all have our multiple identities. It's more a ground-up analysis to say we are connecting. Peoples across the Atlantic basin are connecting in ways they had not in the past, and we should pay attention to that. It doesn't mean that others aren't connecting. It's that this is happening, and for some reason there had been a lack of attention. The Pacific is an example. Decades ago, people started to say, look, something's happening in the Pacific region. All this diversity, all of these differences, but they're connecting in some way, and shouldn't we actually work with that? And now you have, in the Pacific region, which is more diverse than the Atlantic, many more mechanisms of regional or hemispheric cooperation.
Like what, for example? Can you give
us
examples?
APEC, ASEAN, you name it. There are all sorts of, it's just what's happening every day. There's a business council that works on connectivity across the Pacific. Why wouldn't we have something like that in the Atlantic, given these deep commercial, there's more Pacific. We don't know that. We don't pay attention to this. And it's not just in the North Atlantic. So my plea is mainly my concern. If we all wait till we each get our politics right, none of this is ever going to happen. Or if we look to some country to take the lead, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about societies realizing where their interests now are connecting and to try to find ways to work together on problems that really people care about. Say guns, drugs, terror, this type of thing. We can't deal with them well unless we create new ways of thinking that has this PanAtlantic frame to it, for instance. Or the energy opportunity to bring universal energy access to people. We kind of have to start with Africa. And some of the distinction to the Indian Pacific, but I don't think it's a 20th century notion. It's becoming a new 21st century notion, not the old legacy. And obviously colonial legacies, other legacies have stunted this development, and I get that. But if you just look at connections, it seems we all should take another look. That's my basic point.
So on these issues that we share and that the whole world care of today, do you see similarities when you look at Africa and Europe to Latin America to the United States towards the world trade? How do you think that one example can help the other, and how we can get each other?
Yeah, I think certainly there are what's the well, it's more the line from Mark Twain that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. I think there are things that rhyme, I think, between the hemispheres, but I think there are significant differences. I think, the United States, obviously, deep, long history of the U.S. relationship with Latin America, some good, some bad, but it's a long history, certainly. But I think probably the most important thing I think that's developed over the last 20 years or so, I think has been the deepening relationship, I think, within North America, that I think was accelerated after 9/11, also in dealing with the threat that bad policies at our border actually, after 9/11, conceivably resulted in with Mexico and with Canada and other countries in the hemisphere to secure the hemisphere, but also sort of deepen the relationships within the hemisphere on various issues. And I think in thinking about borders and thinking about sort of the transnational issues that we've been talking about, whether it be trade, but also migration and others, the American experience, as in the Americas, I think has been, the real transformation of the last 20 years, I think, has been actually the transformation of Mexico in some ways, into becoming the 11th largest economy in the world. It's a totally different kind of country. Don't believe the rhetoric of Donald Trump with regard to the immigration crisis in the United States. In fact, it's actually negative. It's immigration going the other way. There is immigration. There are issues with regard to Central Americans, but most of them are seeking asylum in the United States because of violence in the Northern Triangle of Central America. But these are issues that the United States and Mexico have deeply cooperated on and worked together on. And Mexico now, I think, is very much more of a transit country for migration and others. So I look at the issues within the Americas from the lens of, the Americas it's a smaller region demographically, and I think the relationships are deeper, I think, especially within North America, but even going further south in the Americas. I think, and flipping to the other side of the hemisphere, of the basin, the relationships between Europe and Africa, I think, are much less developed in the sense of the United States has the advantage of having one huge country to our south that we work very closely with. The relations are much more complex. In terms of dealing with these transnational issues, and I think the populations are different and the poverty levels are different. So I think in some ways it's a greater challenge, I think, that Europe faces in terms of, and Africa faces, sort of working together, how to sort of figure out this new relationship economically, from a migration point of view, from a security point of view, from other ways, than the United States and Mexico and the other countries of the Western Hemisphere have sort of figured out. Now, I mean, this is, again, the view from the Obama chair. The Trump chair views anybody outside of the four corners of the United States is a bit more of a threat, but that will pass. It will pass, and the United States will become normal again, I think, soon enough.
And time is good.
Yeah.
Talking about Africa, I know, Mr. Castañeda, that you don't want to talk about the links between Latin America and Africa, but I'm sure a lot of people here want to hear about that. Why do you think it's not possible? Because there are many similarities and maybe economic opportunities also in terms of agriculture, oil and gas. Countries that can, maybe not of the whole African continent, of course, but at least West Africa. Why do you think it's utopic to talk about these two continents joining?
Well, where there is a tradition, perhaps that tradition can be developed with certain countries. Well, first of all, the Portuguese countries, mainly in West Africa, but also Mozambique, and in the case of Brazil, with some of the other West African countries. There is now a 20 or 30, 40-year-old relationship there, which has created certain foundations on which that can be built on. Some of the Brazilians, I know we have many Brazilians always at the Atlantic dialogues, and I'm sure that perhaps they may want to comment on it. Some Brazilians think, for example, that the opening of a large number of Brazilian embassies in Africa since the year 2002 was building on the previous foundation of economic ties. Others think that this was just President Lula's attempt to get more votes, becoming a member of the Security Council, which was doomed to failure anyway, and which, by the way, failed. And if you ask Brazilians today, given the economic and political situation of the country, a large role in Africa is not something that comes to mind very quickly. The other countries that may have us, just because of size, would be a country like Mexico, which has absolutely no African tradition and will not have one, African in terms of relationships. It's just not in the cards. We can open more embassies or fewer embassies. I won't mention it in regard to Africa, but it was very funny. President Peña Nieto went 3 days in Turkey long before he had gone to the United States when he took office. And his foreign minister at the time told me once, he says, no Mexican president has ever gone to Turkey. Look what we're doing. And I said, well, you might want to ask yourself the question, why? Maybe there was a good answer as to why no Mexican president has gone to Turkey. What for?
To explore new regions, no?
No, it's a beautiful country, it's magnificent ruins, beaches. Istanbul is a great city. Now, what does the president of Mexico have to do there, or in Addis Ababa, or elsewhere?
But it's a good question, because Turkey, for example, or China don't have obvious historical links with the African continent, and they actually have a very aggressive so they can start, you know.
Well, I think it's
something
certainly
that
a
was not there.
worthwhile point of discussion, but I would wish those who think that there's going to be good luck with that.
Mr. Sophie, you wanted to talk about the rise of China also on the Atlantic basin, and especially on the African continent.
It's, I want to speak about it because I think it's very relevant to the discussion which we're having here. And see, the Atlantic Partnership has basically really struggled over the last, I would say, 20 years to manage this new geopolitical reality. And there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, a revisionist Russia, which is sniping away at what remains in its power centers in East Europe, and what remains of East Europe. And then you have this, this rising China. And China, with this very boasting of the two sides of the Atlantic, China has developed a very coherent narrative. It's only a narrative yet, but a coherent narrative on a three-ocean strategy, which is talking about linking through the BRI and the OBOR, the Pacific, the Indian, and the Atlantic. And China, as far as we observe China from where we sit, for all the saber-rattling China does in the South China Seas, its very clear core interests are westward. And China is on a resolute march westward, because that is where the prize lies. Ultimately, it is the kind of a prize which is a Faustian. And yes, it is succeeding. It is pursuing the same strategies which it did in rest of Asia. Completely legitimate. I would not question them. I think in its own national interests, but one can understand why China is pursuing these policies. Now, as a counter, yes, US did develop the idea of the Indo-Pacific, expanded the notion of the Pacific Ocean, brought the Indo-Pacific into as a bargaining point, started with the pivot to Asia. Again, this was not something which Trump began. It was much older than that. And Japan, Australia, and all these others have been roped into the quadrilateral arrangements. Countries like India are pursuing a very coherent strategy, including IPSA in the Africa region. There are very, very bold overtures being made towards the rest of Africa, including Morocco, I think this whole idea of the Atlantic also now needs to be bold and step out and imagine itself in terms of the broader vision of the Indo-Atlantic. And that is where, this is the area which Europe always claimed. 500 years, the Indo-Atlantic was the core of it, was the heart of it all. No, it cannot suddenly disappear. So my recommendation for the future would precisely be that there needs to be a far more coherent partnership across this whole region, across the chain, including partnerships which are very keenly being developed by Japan, by the other Quad partners, Australia, this side of the world.
Carrying their idea, I don't know. I saw some hands, so, wow, I mean, do we have a mic? So, yeah.
Merci. Helga Flores Trejo, former executive director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Washington. Now, Dan, this is a question for you because as somebody born in Mexico who worked on transatlantic relations in Germany and in Washington, I always thought exactly this idea of expanding the understanding of the Atlantic was extremely important. It was really correcting, adding the other persons to the table that we needed to act. But we had a table. We had a find consensus. Now, for me, now, looking at where we are right now, where this was reversible, as Brexit showed, who would have thought that NATO would be under attack, not by the German left, but by the US president? Seeing this, for me, the reaction is, we need to go back to basics. We need to go back to defending NATO, EU, looking at what it is, instead of putting our efforts of expanding and maybe, watering down our efforts. But I don't know, the other would be really, okay, understanding maybe as Joshi, well, forget about the Atlantic, that's 20th century, it's now free flow of data. Let's look at different options. What is it? I mean, what is it in your opinion? Because Atlantic dialogue started.
Should we take another question and then we let you answer?
My name is Marcus Freitas. I'm from Brazil. And I think the genie is out of the bottle, right? If you look at the coast, you see that China is the #1 trading partner to the majority of the countries. And China last year was Brazil's 8th largest investor. As of April of this year, it's #1. I don't see the US reversing that in any of these countries. So what the US can do will be marginal. And that's where I see where even the other aspect that people would look for in values in the US, people haven't done that for quite a while because the values haven't been there. So that's why I see the shift moving to the Pacific, because that's the real interest, trade, and the fact that the leadership that should be provided is not being provided by Western countries.
But we still need companies, politicians to do that. What would be your comments on these two?
Either one can go for, I mean, I could take the second one and leave with the other one. But I mean, I think, look, I mean, there is no substitute for U.S. leadership. I mean, at least from an American perspective, I mean, it has been for the last 75 years. And I think that, I mean, speaking frankly, the United States is doing a disservice to itself, I think, to the world, I think, through its pullback over the last year or so under Trump. It's ironic, because I think that, I mean, the United States played a dominant role since World War II and then after the Cold War in sort of helping create this, foster this globalized world. And there's no country in the world that probably has benefited more from the globalized world, the integrated world, than the United States. And its companies and its people. And it's ironic that we are the country that's pulling away from it. But I think, I mean, certainly, I mean, there is a competition for investment, and China certainly has been aggressive throughout the world, and obviously in Brazil and other places, as the United States. But I guess I fundamentally, over the long run, I mean, I have confidence that this moment in history will pass. A lot more going for it, I think, than, say, China does in terms of its attractive force. I mean, I think, yes, it's true that China is investing in places around the world, but the United States has Apple, it has Facebook, it has, I mean, there is an attractive force, I think, to the United States in terms of how we think about sort of investments, what we think about investments, what we think about America's soft power kind of throughout the world that we have cast aside, I think, really since Trump was elected, in terms of we've made ourselves less attractive, certainly than we have been, but I think I think this is a short-lived phenomenon. I think that the United States, I think, is in the process, I think, of coming to its senses, I think, a bit more, and I think re-engaging in the rest of the world, but it's going to take some time.
So you wanted to say something?
I was asked directly, me. My point is that this is not the political cycle in which we're going to get this kind of leadership to take or something. That's not, I don't think that's a misdirected effort at the moment. The United States has turned inward. Europe, frankly, with all the conflation of crises it's dealing with, is turned inward. All the new initiatives that are being discussed are all about shielding, protecting, hunkering down in Europe. Everything that Brazil is going through right now is not as was said, to an outward-looking approach. So this is not the time, and I'm not arguing for that. I'm saying let's look at actually what's happening, and it's more spade work and non-political leadership at the moment, because that's actually what carries our relationship. So, if you talk about energy, it's about getting, renewable entrepreneurs together with regulatory systems to look at how you can, bring energy access, say, to Africa. That includes the development banks, includes other things that have to be part of that. It's more networking, which the Atlantic, frankly, is really good at. Most of the issues I'm talking about creating a network-centric type of hemisphere, not a state-centric. And it will be our actors that carry that. We talk about guns, drugs, and terror, and the problems on the Atlantic Ocean itself. Most of that's owned by the private sector. So the private sector here can be involved, and maybe with public officials, but it's not going to be driven by national governments necessarily. So we're not at that stage. And I again use it took a couple decades for the first discussions of what was going on in the Pacific before you ended up with some structures. It took a long time. It's not the time for big political initiatives, but it is the time, it seems to me, to do some spade work. Which brings me to the other point, which is about in the point of the Asia and the Atlantic. You know, in the traditional, say, North Atlantic discussion, we're talking about how do we work together, U.S. and the EU, on Asia, and we mean in Asia. We need to also recognize Asia is now in the Atlantic, and how do we coordinate on that? It was mentioned. It's not just Chinese investment. You know, actually the bigger investors in Latin America, frankly, are Japanese. We don't spend much time on that, but they're actually bigger in many countries than China, but we're focusing a lot as a major investor all through both Africa and Latin America. And the rise of the Pacific is actually what is also pushing the rise of the Atlantic because of what you said with all of the port facilities. Look at what's happening all across the eastern part of South America, Latin America, even the United States, and all across West Africa and also in Europe, scramble to build new types of port facilities that could take on these super tankers and create this whole new dynamic that's happening. But on China, you know, I think one has to just look at this. Much of what is announced as Chinese projects don't often come about. One has to distinguish very much between the announcement and look again 2 years later what really happened. We have a that I think is a common Atlantic concern, and what are the principles that should guide our interaction with state-owned enterprises? Frankly, if I may say, it's pretty one-sided. It resembles a colonial relationship. You know, it is, you are exporting a traditional colonial pattern to China, whereas Brazilian economic relationship with the United States are actually much more balanced. And the EU is the largest investor in all of South America by far. The largest center of German business in the world is Sao Paulo. So there are these deep other linkages that somehow sort of escape the narrative. And that's my point about we need to simply look at the facts and change a little bit.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, yeah, in front and then we go.
I'm from South Africa. I know that the notion is that Trump is a negative human being, and I think, and I want us to take a different lens. So for when Trump administration came into power, the first thing they challenged was just US aid. Like, why is America doing funding? Why are they funding Africa? And really, and for me, for the first time, I learned about why aid is important for the US. And I wanted to ask you, sorry. Seth, yes. What are the other radical, unfavorable suggestions that have been brought forward by the Trump administration from a different lens of actually something positive? And I think there are positive aspects of Trump. And I must say, I'm an Obama person. I love Obama. But I really Trump, not just on the negative stuff, but I think there's some positive things that we could learn.
Yeah, actually, aid. We didn't talk about aid as how it can be also linked between the different regions. But
so, I mean, I can answer that question quickly. I mean, as for whether there are positive aspects of Trump, I'm not sure. I can find them. Maybe it's got a bad day or something. But I think, I mean, the one thing I would say about Trump is that, you know, putting Trump aside for the moment, I mean, I think the two things I would say also is, one is that the United States, over the last 75 years since the Second World War, we have been deeply engaged in the rest of the world. But that's one segment of American history. I mean, the long sweep of American history has been more sort of, you know, throwing up walls and pushing at least the Eastern Hemisphere away, not so much the Western Hemisphere. But so one could look at Trump as sort of a return to the norm for America in the sense of being less engaged with the rest of the world and more focused inward. I mean, we are a country of 350 million people in a hemisphere of that, you know, is, you know, 1 billion people or so. So there's something to that. I think the other thing is there's something to Trump speaks for the people who have lost out from globalization and from automation, certainly. And I think, you know, throughout the world, not just in the United States, but we're seeing this in Europe and in other places, I think this sort of populist backlash against globalization, against migration, against trade, and other speaks for that group. So I think, you know, maybe there's the one silver lining of Trump is that it gives voice to that a bit, and it's sort of focusing on that, so that I think it's sort of a primal scream from a certain part of the American electorate that demands, I think, the rest of the, you know, the political elites of the country to focus in and sort of figure out, well, how do we address this problem? The people, and the sort of rising inequality, I think, in the United States, certainly, and lack of social mobility in the U.S. So I think Trump, the one silver lining I see in Trump is that perhaps it will sort of galvanize the elites generally in the United States to sort of think about that problem in a different way. But in terms of other negative things that he's done, I mean, certainly cutting aid. I mean, I come back to since the Iraq War and since other things, I mean, I can't imagine we're going to be sending boots on the ground anywhere in the world anytime soon in large numbers. But what we can do is, through aid programs, diplomatic means, sort of extend our influence and do good throughout the world. And that's something I think that Trump and I think Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, I think fundamentally they do not understand, and they fundamentally disagree with. I think the other thing is the issues of trade. I think probably one of the more disastrous things the United States did, I think, with Trump was pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, this is obviously we're talking about the Atlantic, but the TPP. I mean, that was talk about giving a gift to the Chinese instantly in terms of our trade position in the Pacific region. There's all kinds of other things like that where America's sort of pull inward, I think, has not been well thought through.
And just yes, sorry, I promised the mic to be there. Thank you.
Thank you. Just 2 quick points. My name is José Brito. I'm the Brazilian ambassador to Morocco. First of all, regarding the moderator's question on relations between Latin America and Africa, just to offer a different perspective, because in Brazil, there is a real and deep-seated interest for African affairs. More than half of the Brazilian population consider themselves origin. This provides a very solid ground for cooperation and for Brazil. And there is a lot of interest. For example, we saw yesterday in the panel regarding agriculture cooperation. Africa is one of the regions that are still affected by food insecurity. And South America, and Brazil in particular, has developed a lot of technologies that can be helpful in Africa. And there is a lot of going on in this regard already. So I think the idea of relations between Latin America and Africa is not utopian, or it does not lack interest. On the contrary, in Brazil, there is a real and profound interest in this question. The other quick mention here is that we have a new development that will probably have a result in the coming weeks, perhaps, which is the conclusion of a free trade agreement between Mercosur and the European Union. The European Union is the largest economic entity in the area, and Mercosur is the largest economic entity in Latin America. So this, if we really get to this free trade agreement, which I believe we will, this will really be an important change in terms of transatlantic relations. Thank you.
Just to jump on your first remark, yes, of course, Latin America is huge continent, Africa also, and we can imagine Brazil, Venezuela, for example, like to have natural historical links with Africa. Shouldn't we, like within this ocean basin, create maybe links between different countries that could help to bring then the region together? Shouldn't we start with a few countries, maybe the BRICS countries with South Africa and Brazil started, but isn't it the solution? Yes.
Can I just, some of that is already happening. My point is it's not going to come necessarily from national governments first. It's going to come from eminent persons, from networks, from others that see where the networks can be forged. There are a couple former presidents here from South America that I have worked with. I know President Rodriguez from Costa Rica, very active in Africa. I've been with them a few times where, to give you an example, peer-to-peer in African countries that would like to talk to somebody else who's gone through the experience of what it's like in a country that's maybe more similar than something in the north. President Rodriguez has really good examples of how in Costa Rica he had to try to go through lots of reforms, mistakes. He has a great talk about, it's all about mistakes. Here they are, and here's what we need to think about. I had a good example of African energy officials who went to Central America to find out about the Central American energy market, common energy market. What were the issues there? How do you create that type of thing? This was a very, very good, peer-to-peer exchange. With that, don't start with the, big and the architecture in the sky. Find out if there are real commonalities. But I have, in my experience, pushing on this, found any number of really very practical things that you can do. And I think the ambassador's point is very strong. Brazil has had a significant investment in Africa. I think agricultural research and development, for instance, has been strong. That's very practical link to what African countries, many of them, need. And building on this type of thing. Yes, all of this can happen. It is happening. And I think my notion of this Atlantic Basin Initiative, it has to be owned by the South. This is not, I'm coming from the United States. It won't be, nor could it be, frankly, or a European one. If our Southern Atlantic colleagues believe there's something bigger here and it's something to explore, I think you'd find North Atlantic support, but it's not going to be a North Atlantic initiative foisted on the South. That would never succeed. It has to come from within.
We only have a few minutes, I think like 2 minutes left. Do you want to have some very short, brief closing remarks?
Yeah, just starting up with, or taking off from your point about the BRICS. About 10 years ago, Brazil was particularly active and high-profiled on BRICS in general. Tried to broker an agreement on the denuclearization of Iran with the Turks, and then there was this exchange of letters between Secretary Clinton and the Brazilian government. The Goldman Sachs people who made up the BRICS story made it up essentially for economic reasons. We know that, of course, with the exception of China, the economic projections were way off track. The Goldman Sachs people have now, perhaps a little late, decided that, well, after all, it might have been more complicated. So now they've invented new acronyms and new time frames and all this other nonsense that these people like to do. But what was interesting about the BRIC thing is that a lot of other people jumped from Goldman Sachs to a sort of higher international profile for the 4 or 5 BRIC countries. That not only were they going to be the leading economies in the world 20 or 30 years forward, but also have a very significant international profile. And of course, this, with the partial exception of China, has not happened and is not in the cards for the future. It's just not there. Russia can be a regional actor or be a sub-regional actor or not. China, as Vedrine was saying, is beginning to have a foreign policy, but it takes a while. And the other cases are very similar. So this notion that you have an automatic relationship between a certain economic profile in the world, which turned out, by the way, to be largely false. But supposing it had been true, it does not translate overnight into a greater international role, particularly if you have the withdrawal of the main international actor from the international scene, which is what is happening with the United States. The BRICS international deal had been valid, today you would have the BRICS stepping into the void left by the Trump people. And we know that's not true. And we also know it's not going to be true anytime soon. It's just not there yet. And yet means not a few months, yet means probably several decades.
You're very pessimistic.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, but we're going to unfortunately close on this very sad remark about the links. But I think lunch is calling. We're going to have to close the session now. Thank you very much, all of you, for your attention, and thank you to our guests.
Do we leave these here?
Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy your lunch. We will reconvene at 2 sharp.
Searching for a destiny that's mine. There's another place, another time. Touching many hearts along the way. Hoping that I'll never have to say it's just an illusion. Illusion. Follow your emotions anywhere. Is it really magic in the air? Never let your feelings get you down. Open your eyes and look around. It's just an illusion. 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 Could it be that it's just an illusion? Putting me back in all this confusion. Could it be that it's just an illusion?